For more on this visit, we're joined by Africa Center for the Study of the U.S., Dr. Bob Wekesa. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. We've just listened in to Antony Blinken speaking about the authenticity of a relationship, saying that we seek a true partnership with Africa and speaking about how they're not there to try and outdo anybody. How significant is this true partnership that is made mention of here?
No, I think it is, first of all, a very major shift in U.S. policy towards Africa. Because in the past, what has happened is that the U.S. has sought to force certain principles and ideas onto the African continent. I think particularly issues to do with democracy and human rights, respect for democracy and human rights, and issues such as transparency and accountability. But now what the U.S. is saying is that we want to give African countries choices to make. If they want to, in other words, if Africans want to choose the path of democracy and human rights, they can go with the U.S. But that African countries can also then, if they don't choose that path, they could go with Russia and China is an open choice. I think that is the allusion there. And the idea that the U.S. does not want to force African countries to just go with the U.S. is an interesting one because it has never been framed like that in the past.
Absolutely. And also what was also spoken to here was the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, its ripple effect not only on the world at large, but Africa and the continent. In terms of positioning and the U.S. strategy, what are you reading out of the narrative?
I think to start with the fact that Secretary Blinken's visit to Africa started here in South Africa was quite telling. Beyond the strategic dialogue that was undertaken between Secretary Blinken and Minister Pandor, it is very clear that the Americans want to sway the South Africans to take a different position from what they have taken, which is that there shouldn't be sanctions against Russia for invasion of Ukraine, and that there should be an amicable resolution rather than war, but at the same time that Russia should not be condemned. So I suppose, and you know, South Africa is very important on the African continent because the position it takes on UN matters, such as the condemnation of Russia that the UN has undertaken, is taken by other African countries. In other words, other African countries are likely to follow South Africa's position. And so I think the coming here of Secretary Blinken and the nature of the discussions and allusions by both Secretary Blinken and Minister Pandor seems to suggest that that was a major point of discussion, with Americans looking to lean on to South Africans to change position.
Yeah, absolutely. And also looking at the kind of climate that South Africa and the rest of the continent finds itself in, with poverty, unemployment, and really needing some form of trade boost and investment opportunities that need to open up. How do you see those boding, especially as we know that the trade issues was something Minister Naledi Pandor says she wanted to discuss even further with Blinken?
I think to start with, it's listening to the speech delivered by Secretary Blinken at University of Pretoria. It was very clear that the U.S. is looking to undertake more trade, economic and investment relations with Africa, unlike in the past, where more focus was on political issues, human rights and democracy and so forth. Specifically, I mean, that is Secretary Blinken specifically mentioned the investment, heavy investment in information and communication finance cooperation. In the recent past, much of that investment, foreign direct investment and other forms of investment have actually largely come from China and to some extent Japan. And so it appears that the U.S. is resetting its policy so that it's not just politics and human rights, but also getting into the play in terms of doing trade and investments on the African continent.
Yeah, I mean, it's said to be a visit which signals a new chapter. I mean, after 7 years of silence, do you think perhaps that BRICS may be a bit of a threat when it comes to relations and influence? I mean, we saw just last week the U.S. Army training the SANDF, speaking now to a country that wants to have a very close relationship.
No, certainly the BRICS is something that the Americans and the Western world more broadly will always look at, because particularly within the BRICS, Russia and China are, countries that challenge the U.S. Its status in world affairs, its values such as focus on human rights and democracy, and just so many things in between. So even as Secretary Blinken was saying, we want to give African countries a choice to make. They can choose whoever they want to partner with. The allusion or the indirect message there is that the U.S. is still the best to work with. So in those respects, it is an allusion to the idea that countries such as Russia and China cannot really be the best partners for Africa because they do not support issues to do with democracy. And as Blinken said, he linked democracy to development, saying that, evidence shows that more democratic countries are likely to develop faster, and also even using figures and statistics to show that many Africans actually yearn for democracy, which is not something that is promoted from the Russia and China end of things, amongst the BRICS.
Yeah. Climate change was also a very significant topic, especially as we heard the comparisons there, looking at the April floods in KZN and the devastation that occurred, and also now given reference to what's happening in California with the droughts. And Blinken essentially speaking to committing to help South Africa transition to a low-carbon economy because there's a lot of question marks, and the floods in KZN baffled officials here in South Africa and really pushing them towards finding proper plans and being proactive instead of reactive.
No, certainly. I think all those issues of climate change and energy are interlinked. And I think there are two messages that we got here, at least two broad messages, even though there are other smaller messages within the broader picture. One, from the U.S. end of things, Blinken suggested that an issue such as climate change linked to energy is a global issue that affects all countries, and that countries should come together, including South Africa, to look for solutions to the devastation of environment, and as you rightly put it, issues such as climate incidents, such as flooding and droughts and so forth. I think from the South African end of things, Minister Pandor was very clear that the richer nations of the world, who are actually heavy polluters, and actually are the ones responsible for global warming, which is the real key basis for climate change, bear most responsibility because they are the ones who have wreaked havoc on climate, and that they continue to do so. They are more developed. And so I think under the UN framework, they are supposed to actually help countries in the global south and the poor countries to actually mitigate the effects of climate change. With respect to South Africa particularly, I think there is the idea that if South Africa is encouraged to use clean energy, such as solar and wind power, away from coal, then we have to see clear investments and money from countries such as the United States, and specifically the United States in this particular case.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for weighing in on this discussion, Dr. Bob Wekesa, Africa Center for the Study of the U.S., giving us his take on some of the highlights that came out of the talks this afternoon.